thank you everybody for joining. We're really excited to have you. So to introduce our speakers today, we have Matthew Anderson, the President and CEO of Ontario Health. Matthew is an experienced healthcare leader, team builder, and advocate for positive change. Before joining Ontario Health, Matthew is President and CEO of Lakeridge Health. At Ontario Health, Matthew is leading one of the largest mergers in the healthcare industry, bringing together 22 different agencies. Matthew began his career in data analytics and IT. He became Vice President and Chief Information Officer at UHN in 2000. In 2008, he was named the CEO of Toronto Central Local Health Integration Network. And in 2010, he became CEO of William Osler Health System. Also with us today is Norman Menz. Norman is a passionate cybersecurity expert and tech entrepreneur with over 2 decades of industry knowledge. With a focus on external risk management for the last 10 years, he has extensive expertise in third-party risk, vulnerability management, and cyber threat intelligence. With his deep understanding of the cybersecurity landscape, Norman continues to support organizations looking to fortify their security posture. Matthew and Norman, thank you so much for joining us. I also want to say we have Lyndon Dubois on. He is the VP of Information Security at Ontario Health. So thank you for our speakers, and I'll turn it over to you, Norman.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Eric. Matthew, thank you for joining, as Eric said, and Lyndon as well. Really looking forward to our conversation here today. And what we're looking to do is talk with you, and have you answer some questions and share some strategies about specifically around securing patient and healthcare data, some of the trends that we're seeing specifically, and what the audience can take to help protect patient data in 2023. So I thought maybe to kick things off here and set context for this, I wanted to just maybe we could play a little bit of game of, instead of two truths and a lie, we'll do 2 truths and a current event. And not to put you on the spot, I'll share the information here, but I was recently reading the IBM's data breach report, and they quoted the highest average cost for data breach in any industry is in healthcare, and specifically in the U.S., it's approximately $10.1 million per incident. And while I know this is a Canadian-focused webinar, started to ask myself, how is this relevant? Well, just purely factually, Canada is number 2 on the list. And so the average cost of a data breach in healthcare in Canada is, as you probably are well aware, is $5.5 million, which is a significant cost. But I started to think about the impact. And if you actually adjust that number against GDP, it's very easy to make the argument that the industry that's most affected by data breach is actually healthcare in Canada. And so I wanted to just use that, to kind of start to set the context. So those are our 2 truths. And then the current event is something else. So we look at we're going to talk about the wide attack surface in healthcare and some of the challenges that you all face. But one of the other examples is current events. So on January 27th, the Health ISAC, as well as the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, issued an advisory on pro-Russian hacktivists that were actively targeting healthcare organizations with the distributed denial of service attacks, notably KillNet. And then this was quickly followed up by an advisory from the Canadian CSE. So as and I think this is why the audience is here, you're constantly faced with a very disparate number of threats and risks to your organizations, to your member organizations, as well as your patient data. So a really fun topic, I think, for today. So we're going to roll into some questions here, but let's start with maybe a softball question. Matt, if you don't mind, can you just share for the audience a brief overview of your career as in healthcare as a CIO?
For sure. Thanks very much. And thanks a lot for inviting me to come and speak with you today. And great that I have Lyndon with me for all the tough questions. So I'll handle the easier ones. And certainly a little bit of background for me. So you heard my bio from Eric. I got the opportunity to be a chief information officer. I was a chief information officer for the University Health Network, which is one of our the largest academic center in Ontario, one of the larger ones in Canada. A great opportunity for me there. Probably this would have been back in the late 90s and early 2000s. Probably most of your viewers don't remember those days, weren't even born in those days. But back then it was kind of in vogue to have a young looking CIO because there's this thing called the .com boom and all these things. So it was a great opportunity for me. From there, and I think germane to our conversation, I learned a lot about the healthcare system. I got an opportunity to run the quality committee of the board, and my CEO at the time recognized that health quality and healthcare is integrally linked to the information sources. And I think, Norman, to your point about the value of this information, the impact of this information, this has direct impact on patient care and how we're managing patients. From there, I had the opportunity to take on various CEO roles, and it's been an interesting transition for me to go from a CIO to a CEO. Not many at least in Ontario healthcare, have made that journey, but certainly the background in IT and the background in data has served me well as we get into being a CEO. And now this new world, a relatively new world of this really heightened cybersecurity threat that we face within the system.
Yeah, it's interesting, Matt. It sounds like that view at the time where, you know, the information technology was no longer just a supportive function within the business, but to help drive innovation, as you said, improve patient care is probably a pretty unique and innovative viewpoint at the time as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. For sure.
Absolutely. So looking specifically now at your role today, so within Ontario healthcare, you know, it's known for really collecting and managing one of the most comprehensive healthcare data sets in Canada. Can you share with us some of the lessons that you've learned in your transition from CIO now to CEO, and you know, how you were able to build effective communication between your technology partners in the business, and you know, how were you able to effectively communicate and respond to risks as they evolve?
Yeah, I think so. It's a great question, and I would maybe just a couple of points. First is, and even though I know this, I probably don't practice it as much as I should. Generally speaking, the business side underestimates the impact of technology and on technology. You know, what this is often characterized, and even today, Ontario Health, I won't put Lyndon on the spot, but I'll say it. Even today, we tend to involve the IT folks too late. And we've already built out a business model and a business process. We've got business objectives. Often we even have timelines put together and high-level Gantt charts, and yet we haven't engaged the IT folks to work it all through. And it's so much more complex today than it was even 5 years ago in terms of the things that we want to do and how integrated the IT is into our workflows and the things that we're trying to improve on. So really, lesson one is right from the get-go, you've got to have the IT people in. Even more true today, even more so as we think about you know, the considerations around cybersecurity and so on as we go. The second thing, so that's for the lesson for the business side. I would say for those of you who are on the call from the more of the tech side, the big lesson I would impart is work hard to make sure that you're able to put the choices and the risks in normal human being terms or in business terms. In fact, I would say that even when I was the CIO for about 10 years, rarely did we have technical questions that we needed to bring or technical decisions that we needed to bring to the organization. We could largely do those ourselves within the department. Our goal really was to explain the business choice that people are making. And if you can do that, it really does make a difference. And I'll give a very basic example. Again, probably some of you probably have read about the days of when we had to make a choice between, I think it was Microsoft Explorer or Netscape. And some of you might recall Netscape or heard about it before. If you haven't, Google it. You'll get a little story about it. So the deal was it was many decades ago, and we had to make a business decision. And at the time, most people, at least the folks in our tech world, thought that Netscape was the superior from a technical perspective. Netscape was the superior product to Microsoft Explorer. But the question that we were putting in front of the organization wasn't about technology. The question was about where do we want to go as a business? What are the things that we're trying to achieve through using these technologies? And along that way, it ended up that Microsoft Explorer was the one that we ended up choosing. And we put it down in basic business terms. And I think that that's really, if there's anything that I've been able to to do. And maybe one of the reasons of bridging from CIO to CEO is working hard to take these, what seem like a technical question, but really is a business, and you mentioned it, Norman, in your question, a risk discussion, right? And just trying to outline what the set of risks are if we go down this path versus this path in business terms. That makes all the difference and makes it a lot easier to make for the organization to make a better decision.
Wow, that's great, Matt. Thanks for bringing us back to the days of the browser wars. It's always a fun time, and although it was a long time ago, it's amazing how long it held on for. So continuing kind of on that theme of war, so to speak, if you will, we mentioned before about healthcare having a very wide attack surface, and the two truths and a current event, it really speaks to that. So if you look specifically at things like distributed denial of service attacks, we talk about ransomware, which is probably, potentially has one of the biggest impacts on businesses and organizations. And the ways in which those are infiltrated a lot of times are through people and social engineering. And so when we look at healthcare, like, employees are constantly having to deal with these different challenges. How do you, within your organization, keep information security on top of mind for employees, for staff, and for other people who are involved in interacting or have access to patient data?
Yeah, thanks. I guess a couple of layers to that one. First is I don't know that we have a secret at Ontario Health in terms of how we do it, except that we do it a lot, right? And get the training and awareness out there. And in a sense, if we're not complaining to Lyndon about all the training and awareness he's making, then he's probably not doing his job, right? And so we've got to keep that at the forefront. I would say, things have changed a little bit for the better, in the sense that people are generally just more aware than they would have been, 5 years ago and 10 years ago. And so that helps as we go. But of course, the threats get more and more sophisticated. And so that same comfort that we sort of gain as a society can actually work against us sometimes, because it puts our guard down a little bit, because we're more used to the kinds of attacks that we get. Even for myself, I've been duped, and I pride myself of looking really hard. In fact, it's quite embarrassing when I get duped. And I do, when Lyndon sends out his little tests and I pass, I make sure Lyndon knows that I passed. So it is a lot about getting that. Just a constant training. I do think that the testing, as compared to, we do the usual. We send out the bulletins to everybody and all that kind of stuff. I suspect many delete them before reading them, but we do it anyway. The testing that we do is very important. And then, of course, we have in the background, all the various early warning systems that we're putting in play to move forward. Because as much as we can train and make aware, and even for myself, I like to think I'm very, very attuned to this. I'm very sensitive to it, and yet it can be hard, right? And for those of us who get hundreds of emails a day, which is probably everybody on this call, you're kind of clicking through. How fast it can happen. And in fact, when I did do a breach a couple of years ago, I knew it as soon as I clicked, right? But I was clicking too fast. I wasn't paying attention, and all of a sudden, boom! I've just hit this. So the training and awareness is not enough. We also have to have the early monitoring systems, the work that we have in the background, the different layers of protection that we use. Again, Lyndon can describe them better than me, but all of the security analytics, the AI, the things that we do around, and I would also appreciate the early warning, the suspicious behavior, all of those things that we go through. And I will say, just on maybe that last point, I only kid about the people getting annoyed. I think people really do appreciate and understand what's at risk. And so, the false positive is okay. And it's okay that we send out, and for myself and others, when we get a little notice that says, "Hey, Matt, I saw this. Is this really you? Are you really doing that?" That's good. And I would rather go back to Lyndon's team and say, "Yes, I'm traveling today, and that's why I signed in from Ottawa," or whatever is the flag that went off. I would much rather that than the other side. And I think the tolerance for that is pretty good, particularly in healthcare, because people know what's at stake.
Yeah. Listen, Matt, I think first off, it's really refreshing to hear you be as open and say you got duped. I think, the first and last line of defense in protecting data is people, and the technology is kind of that layer in the middle that we try to use to help that. So I guess in full transparency, I got duped too. So we do phishing attack monitoring, and
I'm starting a support club for CEOs that have been duped.
Yeah, but I think it's important that you create and I think you're speaking to, is you really create a culture of openness and awareness, because literally everybody from, in healthcare, say, for example, a nurse, up through the CEO is all responsible to help, secure and protect that data in the ways in which they can.
Yeah, and I just want one added sort of reflection is that what's also very complicated and I'm sure it's true in other businesses, but certainly in healthcare, is that you're also interacting in real time with various websites, right? And that also is another layer. And this is the challenge that we put to Lyndon and his team, is that we can't close the door, right? We have to have that door open. We're accessing the stuff and in very real time for a number of things. And so that just adds another layer of complexity. The easiest thing, I'm sure Lyndon would love it if we just turned off all of our connections. Ta-da! But we can't, right? No business can do that. And so we have to have these extra safeguards in place.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, so we're continuing to be transparent here, man. I'm going to turn up the heat on you a little bit. From a strategic perspective, could you share with us, like, what are some of the things that keep you up at night as it relates to cybersecurity? And I'll also let you phone a friend on this one, if that's okay.
All right, sounds good. Well, a couple of things that would come to mind for me, and then if Lyndon wants to add a comment, then although the most reason that I sleep at night is because I'm thinking that Lyndon's up at night worrying about these things. So hopefully he won't disrupt my sleep. But I guess there would be a couple things that I would note. One of the things that has changed so substantially for healthcare organizations, particularly in Ontario, I think it's true of all of Canada, is that like 10 or 15 years ago, we were using a lot of proprietary systems in the healthcare space. And what's happened over the last while, for all the right and good reasons, is we're moving to more industry standard software and systems. The Microsoft suite and all that stuff has become even more embedded into our work processes, that sort of thing, and all for good and all for the right reasons. That has made us a lot more susceptible to attacks than we were before, right? When we were on a lot of these proprietary systems, the attackers, they weren't really focusing on that code. They were looking somewhere else. But now, even if they're not aiming for us, we are now part of the collateral impact when they're sending out these hacks and these disruptive tools. So as we've changed that from a healthcare perspective, that can leave us with a vulnerability that we didn't have before. And that is very concerning in terms of how we are able to address that as a system, because there's likely risk there that wasn't part of our risk model, as soon as maybe 5 years ago, certainly within 10 years ago. So have we adjusted how we're managing for that, given the newer technologies that we have rightly moved to? The second and compounding part to that is that, I was sharing a story with my board maybe a couple months ago, where there was a jurisdiction in Canada that got hit really hard with a cyber attack, and it took out, well, at least on the headline, it took out the provincial system. What I said to our board on Ontario Health is that I've got good news and bad news. The good news is that we don't have in Ontario, we don't have the equivalent of that one big front door that if you get through, you get all the data and you can take down the system. The bad news is that we've got hundreds of little windows all over the place. And it goes back to my earlier point of people sort of running their own systems in their own organization. And 10 and 15 years ago, probably okay. But now, as we move into this new world, and you're moving to these more industry standard stuff, if you're not increasing your cybersecurity ability, you're creating a big vulnerability. And I would say that's one of my big concerns when I think about Ontario and the healthcare landscape is not so much that there's a single access point, but more that there's multiple access points out there, and that any one of those can lead to a problem. And we are going to have to respond very, very quickly. And maybe if it's okay, I'll just invite Lyndon to make a comment about our provincial security approach and how we're trying to offset that a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks. So, and sort of the things that keep me up at night are the speed of being, needing to address these vulnerabilities and be able to detect and respond. And so across our healthcare sector within Ontario, we're working very closely with our government partners and our delivery partners to ensure that they are building those capabilities to be able to respond effectively and prevent upfront and make those investments and raise the maturity level. And you can imagine in the way that Matt described the environment it is a complex environment. It is a bit of a wicked problem. However, taking a systems-based approach to it is the right tactic, and working collaboratively. And really in Ontario, cybersecurity is a team sport. So those are sort of the things I would offer at this time and how we're tackling it.
Yeah, Lyndon, if I could follow up on that one too, because Matt mentioned earlier, even the use of, so we talked about the importance of people, but you're talking about technology here and the difficulty of reacting quickly. Matt mentioned our AI and other forms of AI, maybe ML, et cetera, and specifically within the security tool set or the cyber tool set. I was just reading, interestingly enough, actually from that same IBM breach report, that organizations that leverage AI in their security tooling, typically their ability to detect a breach is decreased by about 30%. I'm just wondering, just generally your opinion on the maturity of, different forms of technology, embedded AI, and whether or not from a security tooling perspective, you think that's helpful now, or if it's still got some work to do.
Yeah, so really good question. My quick response would be absolutely 100% it's helpful now, and it will continue to be helpful into the future. And you don't have to look much further than the current news around ChatGPT and the popularity of AI tooling to understand that this year is going to be a watershed year for AI. And if we're not using that as defenders, and a lot of our tooling today has that capability in it, because we do work with really strong partners that have good capabilities, but also the attackers are going to be using that. So I think it's going to be an interesting year.
Yeah, I absolutely, totally agree. Let's focus on the attackers for a second. So, we've talked about, clearly we opened this conversation up with a discussion on some of the current threats. But if we go back to the beginning of the COVID pandemic, there's been a significant increase in attacks on critical infrastructure. What have you and the team learned? What experience can you share from more frequent cyber attacks on hospitals, across the province or perhaps the country and the broader global infrastructure and healthcare?
Yeah, I'll maybe make a couple comments, and again invite Lyndon to add in. The two that I would highlight in particular, one is so a positive and a bit of a negative. The positive is really relying on a trusted partner. So we went out of our way to bring in a trusted security partner, a managed security service provider, and that has helped so much to augment our internal team. And Lyndon can give you the details on it, but I found that even this week, as new risks emerge, being able to bring in a trusted partner, 24/7 service, always up to speed on the top tech, really helps to augment our team. And that's the second point that I wanted to make is maybe, I don't know if it's the negative, but the concept of augmenting the team is, again, one of our big challenges is the competition for resources. One of our senior team members likes to coin that we offer mission and pension. So when we're looking at these resources for cybersecurity, it's difficult sometimes for healthcare organizations, particularly in Canada, to compete with the banks and the insurance companies and everybody else who's also very concerned about the role of cybersecurity. So for us, we try to be very competitive, both from a compensation perspective, but also from a mission perspective, right? And try to appeal to those who are really are interested in healthcare. And sometimes it's hard to feel your contribution to healthcare when you're doing cybersecurity or any of those other things. But I would say that certainly through the COVID period, where we became hugely dependent on our virtual services, the things that, and trying to draw that map back to, these are very real things. If you're helping us on the cybersecurity front, you are helping to deliver patient care and drawing that map through. That said, though, given the competition for resources and given the need to move forward with all the various tools, having playbooks in place, plans in place, making sure that people understand that it's not if you're going to be breached, it's when you're going to be breached, and are you ready? Those things have really sort of driven home. But having that trusted provider as a backstop for us has really made such a difference.
Absolutely. Lyndon, anything you want to add, or?
It's just that I'm very fortunate to have a CEO that understands this domain, and he's spot on. And maybe I'll just mention that often the attackers, by design, don't work at the same time frames we do, and you'll notice that attacks typically surge before holidays or vacations or weekends and those types of things. And so, to match spot on points is having partners that can have eyes on glass 24/7, 365, and work with our core teams is critical for protecting our environments.
Yeah. Yeah, and Matt, you mentioned again COVID, so maybe one follow-up question on the topic of COVID. I was really amazed at how organizations, small and large, especially when we decided to, when people started responding specifically to COVID-19 and rolling out vaccines, how quickly that happened. And if you really stop to think about it, whether you're sitting in the chair with your sleeve rolled up waiting to get your vaccine, like how much work had to go into getting that there. And maybe you could help us understand, specifically for Ontario Health, like how did that vaccine roll out? What were some of the decisions that you had to make in terms of doing that quickly? And then what were some of the trade-offs and potentially some of the impacts from a cybersecurity and risk management perspective as you were dealing with it?
Yeah, thanks for that. I would probably add to the question. So there's the vaccine rollout. There's also and its precursor where we learned a lot of lessons was we had to get a provincial lab network up and running very, very rapidly. And so just a little bit of context for everybody in Ontario, because we have 45 separate labs up until the point of the pandemic, they were not connected. And so we had to move very, very rapidly. And when we think about the lab network, if you step back from that for a moment, and you mentioned the sleeve, rolling up your sleeve, and vaccine is very similar, right? We learned much of our lessons through the lab thing, but vaccine was very similar. First off, there's the acquisition, right? And so in the case of a lab, that means that's when you're getting swabbed. Then there's transportation. We've got to get that swab somewhere to a lab to be tested, and then that has to be uploaded onto a server, onto a database. And then from there, the result has to be communicated out. And of course, everybody wants to communicate it out onto their phone. And you're starting with largely a paper process at the front end, and mainly a paper process. And this is true again of vaccine, because we have to, anytime that in healthcare, an added sort of element to what we do is we have to make sure that we're providing equitable access. So we can't assume that the person at the front end of this has a smartphone. They may not. So we had to map all of those processes through and then bring the system up. Now, in the case of the lab, a little bit different because we already had a system called OLIS, the Ontario Lab Information System, which, for the record, I tried to get that project canceled when I was back as a CIO of UHN. Thank God I was unsuccessful at that. Otherwise, we would not have had that lab system. So there you go. So we had that. In the case of vaccine, we did not have that database. So we had to start right from scratch on that. So I think, this is going back maybe to my very early point. When we had to speak to decision makers, in this case, elected officials and other government officials, we had to explain to them the risks that we're going to have to take when you're trading off for speed, right? Speed was everything in this instance, both when we had to build out the lab network. In that instance, of course, it was so that we could track where the disease was hitting, and without a comprehensive lab network, we just simply wouldn't know. So in that instance, it was speed for that purpose. For vaccine, of course, more obvious, speed was all about containment. And the faster we could get that vaccine out, the more we could contain the spread. So in both instances, we had to describe where our risks were going to be. Largely, and sort of good news is that from a data center or data capture perspective, we were able to capitalize on infrastructure that we already had in place. And so we didn't have to start from scratch for that sort of outer layer of the security that we had to bring forward. We were able to apply a lot of the tools that we already had in place as well onto these databases, which was great. In the case of the vaccine, again, we were able to use a very standard product came through for us on that that had also a good, both the product itself and how do we secure the product. We knew how to do that, so that was really great. Where we had to take a big sacrifice, and it actually did come back to haunt us a little bit on the system, is that we had to compromise at capture. And we did not have a lot of security at the capture level, and we did have a breach, but it was at the capture level, not at the data management level. Through data management, we were able to determine that we had a breach, but that's where we had to take it. But again, because of speed, we just had to balance those probabilities and say we may have some problems at the front end, put some tools in the back again to try to secure the environment. But at the end of the day, you're weighing what's the better public good here, and getting whether it's the lab system or the vaccine system, getting them up and running quickly was worth taking the risk of a little bit of an unsecure capture stage. And then just do back end to see if you can sort of offset it and mitigate it. And largely we did.
Yeah. Well, Matt, again, thank you for being transparent. I think that example really speaks to the trade-offs that we have in everything in business, but even particularly in cybersecurity, is that there's going to be a trade-off. And as you said, you may take on a little bit more risk for the greater good of people's health and well-being. And the important thing, obviously, also is to continue to improve upon it, right? So the decisions that we make today don't have to be absolute. We can improve upon them.
And that's, just before you leave that point, I think that's a really, really important point. And I'm sure, again, everybody on the call, you've heard expressions like perfection is the enemy of progress and all that kind of stuff. And in these instances, that was absolutely true, right? And so, those risks that we had to take when we brought the systems live, they've since been corrected. We've now had our lab network up for 3 years. We've had our vaccine infrastructure up for 2 years. So we can correct as we go and put more layers of security on and all that kind of stuff. But we had to make some of those choices at the front end. And sometimes you have to do that in any business. Sometimes you're going to have to make those kinds of choices. And again, I think where we can take some solace is that we were able to describe those risks in business terms or in human terms, in terms of what we're gonna pick here, and here's how we're gonna mitigate, and then over time we can close those doors.
Yeah, absolutely, great. So I just looking here, we're at time for, I guess, if you will, kind of the structured Q&A, but I would like to throw in one last question for you, Matt, and then we're going to hand it back over to Eric, who's going to take some questions from the audience. And so if you'll bear with me, I'm going to give you a two-part question that we'll close it out with. And so, maybe continue on this concept of transparency and, sharing the knowledge that you've learned over the years. How should information security executives in healthcare tackle, as we've been talking about the increased cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, and are there actions that you'd recommend that the same folks take today, and how they might address those for teams of different sizes?
Yeah, I think first off is just the honest recognition of what we're up against, what the new realities are, and it's not going to change. In fact, it's probably going to get even more challenging, unfortunately. And so there's just an honest reflection that is required. I worry less about that with the cybersecurity executives and more with the non-cybersecurity or non-information security executives, that they are fully appreciative of the world that we're in today. I think as we think about what actions are we going to take, so first off, you can't tell because we're on video, but I'm not the tallest guy in the whole world. And I don't like to admit this, but sometimes size matters. Not that often, but sometimes. And so I do think partnerships, the go it alone strategy, forget about it. Not going to work. You particularly in healthcare, you've got to be looking at partnerships, whether it's the kind of described earlier of the partnership with the private organization as your backstop, or partnership between agencies. But we're definitely going to have to accept that that's something that we're going to have to do. Obviously, making sure that you've got the right expertise on your team, again, can be challenging. Again, definitely on the size of your organization and what you're able, the level that you're able to attract. So you may have to do some partnerships to augment that as well. I'd also say, Lyndon was very flattering to say that I know a little bit about the space. I would say that understanding, if I was still in information management in some degree, and particularly if I had Lyndon's role, what I'd really want to understand is where is the voice for IT, particularly as it relates to cyber, at the decision-making tables, all the way to the senior table, through the program management and project initiatives table, and so on. Where is that voice? Are people seeing it? Because I would say that cyber does have the potential to be the tail that wags the dog. And where it's becoming such a high risk element now that you may in fact change some of your business plans or augment your business plans because of the risks that are associated and how you would mitigate them. At least you have to make the kind of decision that we just talked about, where it's in front of you and you're clear, this is the business choice you're making when you're going down this path. And again, 5 and 10 years ago, and certainly 15 years ago, it really, the stakes weren't so high, and you could kind of get away with, if you introduce some of these concepts a little later in the business process or the system process. In today's world, you just can't do it. And so if I'm an information executive, particularly if I'm a security executive of some description, I would want to know, how is that voice getting up to the decision makers throughout the organization, because that will offset a whole bunch of risk later on and make my life a whole lot better if I'm running cybersecurity.
Yeah, that's a terrific point, Matt. It reminds me, I was on LinkedIn yesterday, and one of my former mentors, who I hadn't unfortunately spoken to in a number of years, posted something, and he comes out of financial services and risk and cyber. There was a picture of him presenting to a group of CISOs, and he was wearing one of those little propeller hats, the beanie with the propeller on it. And the topic of his conversation, I think, is just what you talked about. And it's really important that, cybersecurity leaders should lead and not manage, right? And so the importance of communicating and being that conduit throughout the organization, I think is really, really key and critical to that as well. So I think spot on. Thank you for that. So Eric, we'll turn it over to you. I'd love to hear some of the questions from the audience.
Yeah, perfect. We have 4 questions so far. So we'll start with, what do you think will be the biggest challenge facing the healthcare industry in regards to cybersecurity in the upcoming year?
I think it's less to do with the tech and more to do with prioritization and resources. Again, going back to some of my earlier comments, we really the infrastructure that we put around many of our investments in IT were a little below standard. First off, we knew that in healthcare we operated a little below standard of the banking and insurance industries and other industries. In fact, many years ago, I remember when the TSX in Toronto got hit and was taken down, and they spend way more money than we did at the hospital. It was quite eye-opening, right? In terms of what was going on. I can't remember if that was a cyber attack or just something had gone wrong, but whichever, right? It was this realization that as a percentage of our IT spend, we have been systemically underspending on these tools for the better part of a generation. And so we've got a lot of catch up to do. And that's difficult to do. And as everybody on this call would know, these are in the best of circumstances, these are technologies that it's often hard to get prioritized for funding. And you think about it in healthcare, when we talk about it, you want to fund the cybersecurity, or you're going to buy a new MRI, right? And so these are real choices that have to be made. Again, fortunately, a little bit better because people are starting to really understand, non-IT folks are starting to really understand the impact of cybersecurity. But I think this is going to be a challenge. It's going to be a challenge to get caught up.
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. Are there any other are there other industries besides healthcare that can learn from healthcare's experience in cybersecurity?
Yeah, maybe that one I'll let Lyndon comment on. I have sort of more general answers, but Lyndon might speak specifically to some of the places that we're looking.
Sure, thanks, Matt. Yeah, it's short answer is yes, 100%. If you're not learning from other people's mistakes or their how they're tackling challenges, then that's not a good thing. And so certainly in Ontario, the approach we've taken is to look at international standards that are cross-sectoral. So NIST cybersecurity framework and some of the ISO standards serve as a foundation for what we do. And in Ontario, it's really a Team Ontario approach. And so that's cross-sectoral. So within the healthcare domain, Ontario Health is leading that work with our partners and the ministry proper. And then within other sectors, we certainly collaborate and share information. So, that's anything from municipalities, K-12, higher ed, finance, those types of things. So yeah, for sure.
Eric, if I may too, because I think this was inferred, but I think it's a really important thing. I think one of the things that healthcare has done a really good job is its focus on attention. It's been required around, personally identifiable information, PII and PHI. And I think other industries have been slower to catch up. And I think there's an opportunity that, either healthcare can help guide and coach, or they can draw lessons from that, because I think we obviously see continued demand that people's private information be protected. I think healthcare has done a really good job at that. And I think some of the other industries have been really laggards behind that. And so there's an opportunity for them to play an example and across other sectors as well.
Nice.
Absolutely. One of the themes that came up that you talked a lot about, Matthew, is like the trade-offs, right? There's a trade-off if you want to move quickly on digital transformation and innovation. There might be a security trade-off there, or there's a trade-off if you want to invest in these things that you might not be able to buy a new MRI or X-ray machine, et cetera. So one of our attendees was asking, how can healthcare organizations balance between their security and privacy concerns, with also the need for this rapid innovation and digital transformation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I can give you the yearbook answer, but we know that this is a really complex question. And so I would say that part of this goes back, and so part of it goes back to you need to involve the Lyndons of the world early so that you're actually scoping the project or the initiative or the change correctly, and then setting up a budget correctly. I will say that many would see that as the reason why not to involve Lyndon early, so that, because it's only going to be harder to get the approval when you actually scope out the full response that you need. So just scope out the sort of front-facing part of it, and then the back part, let Lyndon scrounge and figure out his own way of trying to figure out how to get it. And I'm saying it a bit facetiously, but it happens, right? And so there's just sort of an assumption that there'll be this infrastructure in the background that's just going to take care of all of this, and we can just worry about the front-facing tool or application or whatever it is that we're sort of looking at. So I think it is about an honest discussion around that. Now, one of the techniques that we used many years ago when I was at UHN, and it worked well for us then, and is something that we are trying to do here at Ontario Health, is first, take off the top of whatever is going to be your change investment. Take off the top a certain percentage that it's over to build the infrastructure. So you don't have to try to justify that incremental cost with each individual thing that you're trying to put forward. And if you can get that infrastructure in place, then you're only dealing with the deltas of where there may be an ask, a prioritization or a project that is going to tax that a little bit. And a good example of that is when you're looking at using an application or a tool inside a confined environment, probably you've built it, if you're using this sort of percentage basis, you've probably built out a very solid infrastructure to do that. But then we go to Lyndon and say, oh, what we really meant is we wanted it to be mobile. And we wanted people to be able to go off their phones while they're, walking down the street. Well, that's not what we scoped when we put this infrastructure, this sort of broad infrastructure in place. So I think it is being honest about what the actual cost is of doing this, and acceptance that I think is coming around that this is a cost of business, and that you can't say, well, no, we're just going to put the MRI in and we're not going to worry about this. But this is, again, as I say, like, these are all easy things to say. These become really tough decisions when it comes down to that last nickel as to where are you going to put this, and are you prepared to not do a wonderful patient-facing or a client-facing program because you can't really afford to bring the appropriate level of security on board. That takes a lot of discipline that I would say historically healthcare organizations have not shown a great track record on. Yeah,
no, that absolutely makes sense, especially bringing the technical lead in early to help kind of structure that conversation. I think the last question we're going to have time for today: how do you see the healthcare industry prioritizing cybersecurity over the next 5 years? Even thinking over the past 5 years, things have changed dramatically, and I think that pace of change is probably going to continue to accelerate.
Yeah, I think for Ontario in particular, I think it's maybe a lesser problem in other provinces by degree. Because if I back up for a second, in the healthcare landscape, Ontario is an extraordinarily decentralized healthcare landscape, in the sense that not including primary care, we have over 1,600 employers in the healthcare landscape that have a relationship back to Ontario Health, right? We fund 1,600 different agencies. Think, we've got 100 and change number of hospitals, over 600 long-term care homes, et cetera. In other parts of the country, they've moved to more regionalized models. They would still have, it's not everybody under one, but that 1,600 number would be substantially reduced in other parts of the province. But that's not including primary care. You'd still have to work your way through with primary care. So I think that the issue for us, what's going to change and is already changing, is the go it alone theory, and this ability to maintain our independence as an entity. Select our own pieces of software, decide which things we're going to bring live, decide what is going to be available to patients versus to providers. So I think there's going to be a real drive around standardization, more so than we've ever seen before. Largely, again, because we're in a place where each individual organization is not going to be able to generate enough cash to put the infrastructure, the necessary infrastructure in place, right? And again, everybody on this call would know likely better than me, there's a step function that goes on here. Once you hit a certain step, you have to, a certain level of functionality, you have to take that step in cybersecurity. Even if your transaction level is relatively low, it doesn't matter. The nature of the transactions have now changed what you're doing, and you've got a step function cost. And you just simply can't afford that step function cost if you're by yourself. So I think that will be one of the biggest changes that we'll see, with the idea of, can we share some of these costs, because we simply aren't able to, and we're learning it the very, very hard way. But I would say that healthcare organizations right now are very attuned to what's happening. And it is, I don't know if it's, by the math, it feels like at least once a week, we're getting another fairly substantial breach happening. And I think the organizations are at the place of saying, okay, we really need to do a fundamentally different approach to how we do this. And I just want to add that's going to lead to other interesting dynamics as we get into, procurement rules and trade agreements. And as we want to start to rationalize the environment more, there's a whole bunch of trickle down effects that we have to work our way through, not the least of which is innovation. And so how does innovation play a role in this? If you're trying to standardize, if you're going to move from, hundreds of different procurements per year to 5 or 6 procurements in a year, what is that going to do to our opportunities to innovate? So there's a whole bunch of other trickle downs that we're going to have to think our way through as we start to see this rationalization driven off of the cost and the risk associated to cyber.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Matthew. Thank you, Norman. Thank you, Lyndon. It was fantastic to have you today.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you all
Thanks.
very much. Terrific.